In a late night bombshell, US President Donald Trump said that he made a direct phone call to Prime Minister Modi, sealing the long pending trade deal with immediate effect. Now, tariffs have been slashed, penalties have been dropped, and a massive buying promise is being made for India. Here are the big takeaways from the Trump-Modi announcement. Remember, Trump made that announcement on Truth Social late last night. Prime Minister Modi responded this morning, posted on Truth Social. Trump said that he spoke to Prime Minister Modi, called him one of my greatest friends and a powerful and respected leader. And then came the headline move. The United States says it will now charge India a reduced reciprocal tariff of just 18%, down from 25%. So for Indian exporters, this is an instant relief. After months of uncertainty and fears of trade disruption, clarity has now finally arrived, especially for sectors like engineering goods, textiles, chemicals, auto components that rely heavily on the US market. But that's not all. In a major reversal, Washington has also scrapped the additional 25% penalty it imposed on India over India's purchase of Russian oil. According to US officials, this rollback follows India's commitment to stop buying Russian oil and instead source its energy from United States and potentially also from Venezuela. This marks a dramatic climb down from the August 2025 rhetoric when Trump had threatened tariffs of up to 50% on Indian goods. But now comes the quid pro quo. Trump says that Prime Minister Modi has committed that India will buy over $500 billion worth of US goods, spanning energy, technology, agriculture, coal and more. So agriculture, that's important there. Even more striking is Trump's claim that India will move to reduce its tariff on US goods, in fact move it to zero. Zero tariffs and non-tariff barriers on US products. Now, Prime Minister Modi this morning welcomed the deal. He thanked Donald Trump for what he called a historic reduction in tariffs. Prime Minister Modi said that he had a wonderful conversation with his dear friend Donald Trump and thanked him on behalf of 1.4 billion people in India for the reduced tariffs of 18% on Indian goods. Now, he did not mention a trade deal at all in his post on social media platform X. Modi also did not comment on Trump's claim in their conversation that Prime Minister had agreed to stop buying Russian oil. So Prime Minister Modi did not confirm that India will not buy Russian oil anymore. And purchases of much more energy from the US, even those comments were not catered to. So the Prime Minister also did not clarify whether India will stop buying Russian oil and buy more energy from the US. But responding to the announcement, Sergio Gore, who is US's ambassador to India, he took to social media platform X and underlined the personal rapport between the two leaders and the strategic promise of a partnership that is growing. He wrote that President Donald Trump genuinely considers Prime Minister Modi a great friend and the relationship between the United States and India has limitless potential. Now, India enjoys one of the lowest tariff rates in Asia at just 18%. India has edge ahead of key regional competitors, which gains India a clear advantage in its access to the US market. From tariff threats to trade thaws, Trump and Modi may have just reset the economic equation, and there are, of course, great many permutations, combinations that will have to be worked out as far as that trade deal is concerned. We don't have the details just as yet. Joining me on the show is my colleague Kartik Malhotra, executive editor at News9 from the newsroom. Kartik, apart from all the hyperbole about how important this deal is for India and US, if you look at the arrangement that Donald Trump announced, one that India has not readily accepted or clarified on, it essentially means that Indian goods will now be taxed at 18% in the US market, clearly giving Indian exporters an edge in the US. But as far as US's goods to India is concerned, they will now invite a 0% tariff.
Right. So, there are claims and so far there are no counter claims. So, one has to go with what one knows and what one has read, Shweta. So, you're right. I think, the statement that came out, if we can call it that, from US President Donald Trump on his Truth Social has far more details than what we have so far heard from the Indian side, though we've been made to believe that very shortly a statement is going to be released, an official statement will be released from the Indian side as well. So, if we were to sort of literally discard the hyperboles, I think it's important to note that India's tariffs, India's export tariffs on US have significantly reduced from 50% to 18%. And that clarification also came from Sergio Gore late last night, where it was pretty much made clear that the 25% secondary tariff on account of India's purchases of Russian oil have also been eliminated. But has India agreed to zero tariffs? We don't know as yet. We also don't know, as a matter of fact, whether India has completely agreed to stop buying Russian oil and has indeed committed to buying American oil, American energy, as well as potentially Venezuelan oil. What we also don't know are the contours of what involves in that $500 billion which US President Donald Trump is saying that India has committed to purchasing from the US. Because remember, among the 4 sectors that are mentioned in the US President's statement, one of them is also agriculture. And agriculture, if you remember, was pretty much the red line that India had drawn, that India is not going to be willing to open its agriculture sector to cheap US imports, including soybean and GM.
So, on agri specifically, because I think that's what Donald Trump has also outrightly written there. And if we go by what we know so far, there's been no clarification from India's side whether agriculture is a market we are going to open up to US exporters. But if that has been agreed on, I think that's a major substantial decision that India has arrived at, knowing that in the past many months, agri, dairy, were the 2 reasons why the deal wasn't really going through.
So I'm sure there has been some negotiation, Shweta, and let's not sort of, second guess what is in that document until that document is actually made public and visible to us. But you're right. I think, agriculture was, of course, one of those key question marks looming not just over the India-US trade deal, but also the India-EU FTA, where again agriculture has been pretty much left out of the ambit of the negotiation. So even with the trade deal with the US, I'm fairly confident that there would be a quota, there would be maybe, a certain variety of crops and to a certain quota which may have been agreed upon. But of course, the larger question really is that we are also looking at, parts of that information being concurred by from the Indian side. Prime Minister Modi's tweet made it very clear. In fact, he thanked US President Donald Trump that that tariffs have indeed been reduced to 18%. He did not mention whether India has reduced its tariffs on US imports to 0. That tweet rather did not even mention the fact that we are going to be open to cut off our oil purchase from Russia altogether and introduce Venezuelan or US oil in the energy mix. And of course, no mention of that $500 billion as well. So, but, contrary to that, the US Secretary of Agriculture has tweeted out just a short while back, thanking the US President Donald Trump that the agriculture sector in the US is now up for a big boost with this deal, so to speak, agreed upon. And US farmers are going to get access to the Indian market. So agriculture continues to be one of those gray areas. It should have been a far greener area, but it happens to be one of those gray areas where clarity is still awaited.
There is a greener area, and that's the stock markets this morning. As you mentioned, it's good news for exporters, Indian exporters who've been waiting very patiently now for many, many months to get some sort of clarity. So the markets, of course, Karthik, reacting positively on back of that news. What are the key sectors in your understanding? I know you've spoken to experts this morning. What are the key sectors that are likely to benefit?
Pretty much every export-oriented sector, Shweta. You look at textiles, you look at gems and jewelry, you look at garments, you look at textiles as a whole, you look at pharmaceuticals. Pretty much every sector that is involved in exports to the US are definitely likely to move even in the greener territory from here on. This morning, in fact, markets opened very, very strongly. Sensex was up almost 2,200 points as markets opened at 9:15 a.m. Nifty 50 was up about 700 points. There were talks, at the end of last calendar year, starting of this year, that there are going to be 3 major factors which will determine the mood of the investors. One would be the Q3 earnings, second would be the union budget, and the third would be the India-US trade deal with no timeline to it. All those 3 boxes have been checked. In fact, it's been a mixed bag of corporate earnings. The budget, to some extent, was a bit of a dampener when it comes to no real impetus, if at all, with that increase in security transaction tax for the F&O segment going up slightly. It was a bit of a dampener. So markets have recovered from those lows that we saw on Sunday, immediately after the budget speech was delivered. So it's gone significantly higher, 2.5% or so, but we are still some distance away from those lifetime highs which the markets were touted to attain as soon as the India-US trade deal was struck. But again, I think market is going to react once those final contours of the deal, the fine print of what has been agreed upon becomes a little more clearer. We will be able to potentially see which direction the markets take from there. But for FIIs, definitely as a sentiment, it's a big positive, because all of 2025 we saw this mass exodus of foreign capital into the Indian capital market. So with this trade deal now at least having been agreed upon, we don't know whether or when it's going to get signed, but with the agreement in place, the sentiment has definitely shifted more favorably towards India.
Absolutely. This sentiment has been bolstered, and markets, of course, reflecting that positivity. Sensex is up about 2,400 points, Nifty up about 740 points as of this afternoon at about 12:30. But stay with us, Karthik, because more reports coming in as far as Reuters report on India agreeing to buy petroleum, defense goods and aircraft from US is concerned. The report says while partly opening up its highly guarded agriculture sector under a trade deal, the Indian side has now agreed to buy more petroleum, defense goods and aircraft from the US, and this according to a government officials, as two sides now reconcile after months of tension. Trump said that India has agreed to buy more American goods, with purchase rising to as much as $500 billion, including energy, coal, technology, agriculture and other products. The Indian government officials, who did not want to be named for all the right reasons, said that India has agreed to buy US goods, including telecom, pharmaceuticals, and offered market access for some agriculture products as part of New Delhi's commitment under the deal. So some agri products, perhaps not all agri products. That's what sources are saying in the government. Now, India recently offered select market access for agri products to European Union as well under a trade deal. The Asian nation has now lowered tariffs. India has lowered tariffs on imported cars to also address Washington's immediate US demands to conclude the first tranche of the deal, according to official sources. The commitment to buy US products cover sectors like pharmaceutical, telecom, defense, petroleum and aircraft. It will be done over the years. And there's also, understanding coming in that there's going to be a more comprehensive pact with the US going forward, which will be negotiated over coming months. So, Karthik, although as we know so far that Indian government, apart from, thanking Donald Trump for making that announcement out of the blue late last night, has only said that a trade deal has been negotiated. We now know that perhaps this is the first tranche, and a detailed trade deal will be negotiated over coming months. And as you rightly pointed out, as far as that big hurdle by the way of agri sector is concerned, India may have agreed to open agri, but partially.
Absolutely. So again, those finer details, the fine print, the final contours of what is in that trade deal is still awaited, as is, a statement, an official statement from the Indian side, because what we know right now, honestly, is quite sketchy. And you started the conversation wanting to discard the hyperboles, but, with the US president, hyperboles is something that pretty much goes hand in hand. So, of course, I mean, he's also gone on to praise Prime Minister Modi, called him a great friend again, called him a strong and powerful leader of India. So, that camaraderie which was also in question at some point, where we were, the entire country and in fact part of the world was questioning how close that friendship really is. If you remember, one of the first statements that Sergio Gore made when he took over as the Indian ambassador, as the US ambassador to India, was that Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump are close friends. And that is a sentiment which has been echoed ad nauseum both by the US president and the Indian Prime Minister in their respective social media posts. But beyond that, of course, the official document and some sort of a release which tells us, has India indeed agreed to zero tariffs, and whether the agriculture and the oil story which the US president is talking about, how true that is something that we will, of course, wait for the official clarity on. But sticking even to the headline 18% tariff, Shweta, it sounds like a great headline when you compare it to either the 25% reciprocal tariff
or the 50% overall tariff.
But starting with near zero tariffs in the pre-Donald Trump second term era, 18 is still a little high. 18
is too much, starting from zero. 18 is still too much. But anything, I think, less than a 50% will be hailed today by India's exporters. But I want to, before we wrap this up, two things that I want to discuss. One is, of course, India's energy needs. And we're looking at various source-based reports because we don't have clarity yet. A lot of sources today saying that India's energy needs are highly diversified today. So while India's India's import of oil from the US has increased over the past month, it cannot entirely cut down its import of Russian oil. So even that will happen in a phased manner. So India's commitment as far as not importing Russian oil will not be implemented anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, again, like you mentioned, we'll have to wait for the final details, and if at all there are any on India's expansion or diversification of sources of energy. But you've also got to bear in mind that there are shipping costs involved. So if India continues to buy from OPEC, and even if you assume for a moment that India cuts off its oil trade with Russia, if India were to buy from OPEC, then it's a very small Arabian Sea that brings all the crude to India. But if India wants to increase its oil purchase from the US and potentially in future even from Venezuela, we are talking about the Atlantic Ocean and part of the Pacific Ocean also being crossed before it enters the Strait of Hormuz and comes through the Arabian Sea back into India. So we are also talking about longer shipping routes and larger shipping costs. So that balancing act is something India will have to do. So far, India has maintained strategic autonomy. India has stated multiple times on domestic and international fora that India is going to do everything when it comes to its energy needs to protect its national and economic interests. So that is something which India, so far at least, continues to be steadfast on.
And you know, as far as politics of it is concerned, we just heard a couple of ministers, standing up in Rajya Sabha talking about how it appears that at this point, and this is all political, of course, that India seems to have buckled under pressure. There was, of course, tremendous pressure over many, many months now to arrive at a trade deal. And the opposition parties obviously saying that it appears prima facie that India has, buckled under pressure from zero tariff to now Indian goods being charged an 18% tariff. That and the fact that, there's been a lot of back and forth between India and US, especially Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi. While the camaraderie seems to be alive and intact today, the past many months, the stoic silence and the exorbitant tariffs did not really reflect on a good partnership going forward. So obviously that wasn't a happy phase, but even today, a deal which wasn't officially announced by negotiators, wasn't officially signed by the two parties, was announced on a Truth Social post. So that, of course, is a bone of contention for opposition parties.
Yeah, so Shweta, honestly, if I were to just take a sort of very objective, dispassionate view, which trade deal with the US has been announced to negotiators? It's always been US President Donald Trump with that big bold signature, signing executive orders and flashing them for the world. In fact, even the first tranche of Liberation Day tariffs, which came on the 2nd of April, if you remember, I don't know if you can pull those visuals, was pretty much a nice white-colored board with country names mentioned and the tariff mentioned, against those countries. So overall, if you look at the history of how the US president operates, I don't think he wants any negotiator to steal his limelight. The word has to come from the US president and the US president alone, and that is something which is at play even this time around. Look back at the at the Japan deal, $550 billion of investment commitment. No Japanese negotiator made that announcement. No US negotiator made that announcement. The announcement came on Truth Social by the US president. Look at the South Korea deal, $350 billion of investment commitment. It came through the Truth Social post by the US president. So I don't think there's a single trade deal in the last, a little over a year that the US president has been in office, about 9 months, 10 months or so of those Liberation Day tariffs. Not one of them,
right,
to my mind, has been formally first announced by the negotiators. It's always been done by
Absolutely.
the US president himself.
He's
talking about politics.
So he stopped 8 wars and he's made all the announcements. He's taken credit for all the trade deals there.
You're right.
And that, of course, continues to be our story at this hour. Karthik, thank you very much for taking time out. Thank you for joining us on that developing story. We are, of course, waiting for contours of that trade deal between India and the US.